Interval notation is a very important part of section 2.7. So what I'm going to do here is just try to explain a little bit more about the interval notation. You know, think about what an interval means just in general terms. You know, if we talk about an interval of time, like I could say my class starts at 8 o'clock and it ends at 8:50. Well, that's an interval of time. It has a starting point and a stopping point. Well, with our inequalities, if we solve an inequality and we get an answer that says something like x is greater than 2, well, I have an interval, you know, a group of numbers that would make that true, right? What would be greater than 2? Well, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, all those are greater than 2, but even, you know, 2.1 is greater than 2. So how do I describe that as an interval? Well, to me it kind of helps if I look on the number line, you know, if I have 2 here, then everything to the right we know is greater, everything to the left, you know, we know is less. So if I wanted to shade and represent everything that's greater than 2, well, you know, I'm going to start at 2 and shade to the right. So all of this would represent the interval of numbers that's greater than 2, okay? Now, does this statement say that x is equal to 2? No, it says it's greater than. So we have to have some kind of notation that explains that. So we use a parenthesis. Okay, so when you see a parenthesis, this means when I look at this, oh, okay, x is everything above 2, but it does not include 2. And so when I go to write my interval notation, I have to kind of think of it as like a starting point and a stopping point. Where did I start shading? Okay, I began shading at 2, and then where would this stop? You know, we know it's not going to stop. It's going to keep going forever, but it's approaching positive infinity because it's going to the right. Okay, if you shade to the right, infinity is going to be on the right side of your interval notation. Now, as far as your parentheses, infinity always gets a parenthesis. Your number should match what you have on your graph. So if it's just greater than or less than, you would have a parenthesis. Okay, the only difference, or the other difference is, you know, when do you have a bracket? Okay, if I had, again, the same problem, x is greater than or equal to 2, okay, then again I would say, all right, I have this group of numbers. What would be included in this group? Well, I look at 2 on the number line, greater than, so that means I shade to the right. But okay, when I look at it, I say, well, this does mean that x can equal 2. X can be greater than or equal to. So I have a bracket that we use for that. The bracket means, oh, when I look at this, okay, x can be 2 or anything above 2. And so when I write my interval notation, I want it to be the same way. Bracket, I began shading at 2, and this is going to stop, or it's going to go to positive infinity. Infinity always gets a parenthesis. Okay, so we can see what's common with these two is that they were both greater than. So that means they were both shaded to the right. And infinity was on the right when we look at our interval notation. Okay, the difference is this was just greater than, so I had a parenthesis. This was greater than or equal to, so I have a bracket. Okay, all right, let's look at one more kind of example you could have. If we have that x is less than, we'll say, we'll keep 2. Okay, x is less than 2. Okay, so that means on my graph, here we have 2. Less than 2 is going to be the interval of numbers to the left of 2. So I'm going to shade to the left. All right, this only says x can be less than 2. It cannot equal 2. So I'm going to use a parenthesis. So I know when I look at that graph, that means, okay, x can be anything up to 2, but not including the 2. So my interval notation, if I'm shading to the left, then I'm going to have negative infinity on the left, okay, as my starting point, if you want to think about it that way. I started way out here in negative infinity, and then I stopped at 2. Infinity, if it's on the left, is always going to be negative. Okay, it doesn't matter what your sign of your number is up here. It's just what direction you're shading. Okay, so parentheses around the negative infinity, parentheses around 2 because x does not equal 2. All right, if I have x is less than or equal to 2, then I'll look at my graph. Here we have 2. Less than, the interval of numbers less than 2, all the numbers to the left. But this also means can equal 2. So I'm going to use the bracket. Okay, so now I know that when I look at that graph, that I began shading at negative infinity, because it's shaded to the left. Then I stopped at 2, but I want to include 2 in my group of numbers, so I put a bracket. Parentheses always around infinity. Okay, so look at what's similar here. They were both less than. X was less than 2, so we shaded to the left, and negative infinity was on the left. Okay, the only difference is with the parenthesis and the bracket, if it's equal to 2, then we're going to use the bracket to indicate that. So I hope this will help maybe clarify just a little bit the interval notation that you're asked for when you're solving inequalities.